Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hi-Fi Preschool and Kids Weekly Training Podcast. We are so excited that you are joining us today. And joining me today, I have part of the Hi-Fi team. I have Crystal.
Hello.
And I have Rachel.
Hey.
We are so excited for all of us to be coming together to talk about this week's session of I Can Listen to God as we dive deeper into the truth of the month, which is I am meant to know God for kids and God wants me to know him for preschool. And this week we are going to dive into that main idea of if I can listen to God. So we always like to have a fun question to start off with, just like we do in Hi-Fi Team Time. So Rachel, Crystal, I have a question for you. Now, there are some board games that are a little bit divisive, okay? Maybe this is the one where pieces sometimes get thrown across the dining room table, or maybe there's a board being flipped. I don't know. But is there a game in your family that has to come with a disclaimer if you are playing it with someone else?
Most games were pretty competitive.
I want to see this. I want to see competitive Rachel just come out and flip a Monopoly board.
But I was going to say Monopoly is the one that gets us more than any other game. We have this, my mother-in-law made us this personalized Monopoly board. So it's really fun to play because all the places are our pictures and our names and, things about our family. So it's really fun to play. But, we have tears and a lot of frustration sometimes. Because
how much is the rent on Raquelme Way? That's really what I want to know.
I don't remember, honestly. But it's a lot. We even have a dog groomer for our dogs, and it's really fun.
That's so cool.
That's so much fun. But I could definitely see tensions rising in Monopoly.
Yes. And the dog pieces, the dog properties, are the ones that everybody wants.
Oh,
of course.
Very nice. Crystal, what about you?
Well, we are definitely more of a video game family than a board game family. And there's one game on the Switch that is called Overcooked, where you all have to work together to complete these orders that are coming in. And it all the levels, it changes. So one time you'll be cooking in a regular kitchen, but then another time you're cooking and food is and plates are moving around to different places, but you can only stay on one side. So you're yelling at one another saying, I need you to do this. I need you. Who's doing this? Who's doing that? And then at the end, my oldest, my 20-year-old, he usually will grab a fire extinguisher because if there's fires on the game, you have to put them out. And he just spins in a circle, spraying it everywhere on the game. And it's just, it's insane because we always say that we're going to start off and we're going to stay calm and we're going to listen to one another. And by the end, it is just sheer and utter chaos. I don't know why we play the game because it gets over and we all have to go our separate places because tempers are kind of high and it's everybody else's fault except your own. So yes, Overcooked on the Switch, I think is maybe the most divisive game we've ever played.
That's amazing. Yes. Ours and my family is Bananagrams. My wife, she is a communications director for a church, and I like to write stuff. So Bananagrams is our game. But I will say for the first 3 years of marriage, I don't think I won. She was pulling out these words, and it was really embarrassing. And I'm a very competitive person, and she's not. So she didn't care that she was winning, and I cared a lot. So I think it was only me scattering pieces, but it was, it was a time. It was a time. Well, nice. Today in our session, we are going to be talking about a little bit of a divisive situation in a family, and this is with Abram and Lot. And when Abram brought Lot to this new place that God had called him, there was a lot of good land, and there was what are you guys laughing at?
I'm laughing because you said a lot of good land. It's about Abram and Lot, and you said a lot of good land. It's really funny. I thought it was funny.
It was very well timed.
It's good, and he didn't even do it on purpose.
Didn't even do it on purpose.
Really sorry, keep going.
And there was a divisive moment in their family because when they got to this place that God had called them, there was a lot of good land and they didn't know what they were going to do with it. Who was going to have a certain well? Who was going to graze their sheep in a certain place? And there was some tension between them. So when they were trying to choose who got what land, Abram trusted God and he let Lot choose the place that he wanted his family to go. And then Abram took what was left. And God promised him that that land was going to be used in an amazing way to bring God's people to him. That was going to be the place where God's people lived. But that wasn't the obvious piece of land. That wasn't the nicest piece of land. But God promised Abraham that if he trusted him, if he listened to him, that he would bless him. Now, as humans, there sometimes feels like an obvious route to take. There seems like an obvious plan. We have the best plan. But how can we listen to God and his plan rather than just blindly follow our own plan? Crystal.
Yeah, I think that this is such a great thing for us to tell and teach preschoolers and kids. We as humans made in the image of God have logic. That's one thing that sets us apart from the rest of creation is that we are able to reason. We are able to think. And I think it's important to know that that intuition, that reasoning that we have is a gift from God. It is something that we have. However, because of the brokenness caused by sin, I think that we can rely on that too much. We follow what seems right, what's easiest, what goes with the flow, what we want most over that pausing and saying, what is going to be God's best for me in this situation? And when we look at this Bible story specifically, it's interesting to note that Abram had every right to choose first, to look and to say, I'm going to do this. And then Lot, you get what's left over because Abram was the patriarch of the family. He was the older one. He was the one with, more power, more prestige, more possession. He had every right to choose first. And yet we see this moment where he pauses and he listens to God and he allows Lot to choose first. And then he takes what's left over. He doesn't complain. He doesn't grumble. At least we don't see that. He might have felt a little in his heart like, oh, I kind of wanted Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure later on he's pretty glad he didn't take it. But anyways, but it's this moment where he just pauses and he says, God, I'm going to trust you in this moment. And I think that's an interesting thing about listening to God that we get to teach preschoolers and kids is that listening, it's not just listening, but it's listening and following. It's listening and obeying. Because we can listen to God and be like, all right, I hear you, but I still would rather go and do this. I still would rather choose my own way. Like this way just makes so much sense. It's obvious. It's right. It's what everybody else is doing. It's what feels right inside me. But it's listening to God and saying, God, I'm going to trust you over myself. I'm going to trust you over what seems obvious. And sometimes God does tell us the obvious thing, right? Like, God, should I reach out to my neighbor because I know that she's going through a really hard time. And I just want to know, like, is that the right thing to do? Seems obvious. And God's more likely than not is going to say, yes, yes, you should. And so I think he does sometimes lead us on the obvious path, but it is that moment of in those decisions that we just stop and say, God, I want to listen to you and I want to trust you over myself and even my own desires and my own instincts.
That is so, so good. And I think with all of that, as we tend to listen to God and the path that he chooses, that knowing who he is, knowing God plays such an important part in that. Because, we know in Hi-Fi that every session stands alone, but we can trust God. And when we trust God, we have more of a tendency to listen to his plan for us. When we see what God has done in our life, we have more of a tendency to listen to him. Now, listening is not always easy. And coming from a kid who tended to talk a little bit more than they liked to listen, Rachel, I want to add, I know, everyone just paused the podcast and said that was news for the day. No, I know. It's pretty obvious. But Rachel, I want to ask you, how can we show preschoolers and kids the importance of listening to God?
Yeah. You're right. It is a hard one because I think about when I was a kid, I definitely enjoyed talking more than listening. Maybe some in adulthood too. But it's, we define prayer as talking and listening to God. And so it's easy to think about talking because it's concrete. We hear ourselves talking, we know what we are saying, but listening is harder. One way we can listen is to be quiet and give time to think and to listen as we pray to God. Another way we can listen to God is through his word, the Bible. We can read God's word, we can listen to him and obey what it says. And we can listen to God by listening to others that follow God, listening to their advice, listening to them teach us about God and who he is and how God's worked in their lives. And the final way we can listen to God is like what Crystal said, by doing what he tells us to do, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it doesn't seem like the obvious choice or thing to do, we can obey God and do what he says. And that's what we're talking about this week, because listening can be a little harder to do. It can be harder to define. It's a little more intangible. But I love that we get to see an example of Abram listening to God, doing what God says and following him.
That really is such a good example that we can look to, because sometimes we need those examples. Sometimes it's great to hear these things and hear these truths and hear these main ideas and then be like, all right, what can I actually do with this? And this month we've been talking about so much how we can know God more, how God is a God who wants us to know him more. But question for both of you is, how does knowing God more actually help us listen to him more?
This actually makes me think about a trend that I've seen on videos online right now, where they'll have a little kid sit in a chair, and the kid's family will line up behind him, and each family member will stand behind him and say the kid's name, and then the kid is supposed to guess which family member said that. And I think it's really fun because there's obviously some people that the kid gets right away, because these are people whose voices he's heard a lot. That tends to be mom, dad, brother, sister, whoever it is. Some of those aunts and uncles, you can tell they're kind of like, I'm not sure who that is. And so I think this idea of like, the more that we get to know God, the more we recognize when he is speaking to us and when he is leading us, because we know how he tends to speak and how he tends to lead. And so, whether again, like Rachel brought up those examples of like reading the Bible and seeing kind of what he does, but I think too, just sort of those, when we develop a habit of prayer, of actually like spending that time listening to God, just being quiet and saying, God, speak to my heart. It can be really hard at first as we start to develop those habits, but after a while we get to know him. We get to know the way that he speaks, the way that he leads, the way that he reassures us. So though in those moments then that come later, as we're having to make a decision, go down a path, trust God and all kinds of stuff, it's like we're more prone to listen because our hearts are more in tune with him, because we know him better. We know how he tends to lead. And so I think that's amazing. It's almost like a married couple who, the further they get along, like they can just look at each other and know what the other person is thinking and what they're saying. It's like they can listen without even having to speak. And I do think that that happens with us and God as we spend more time with him and get to know him more. We hear his voice, we recognize it more and more often.
Crystal, I love that, especially that idea of recognizing his voice. I know we just got to preview the Bible stories for this coming May, and we're actually going to be doing the story of the shepherd, and the shepherd who the sheep hear his voice and recognize his voice. And that is what God has called us to do as one of his followers, to hear his voice and to follow him. Rachel, what about you? What are some ways that knowing God can help us listen to him more?
Yeah, I was thinking of that Bible story as well. I was thinking as Crystal was talking about John and how Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. And how when we listen to God more, when we know God more, we recognize his voice. But not just his voice, I think also his character. And knowing his character and the things he wants from us, the things he says in his word, the things that we can know, oh, God desires this for us. He desires us to grow in this. I think knowing his character helps us discern if it's him speaking and what he's saying, because as we know the things God says and the way he works, we're able to discern that it's him. And so I think it's really important that we not just learn his voice, but also his character.
That's good.
That's such a great reminder, because sometimes when I'm praying and asking God for a decision, I'm like, ooh, is that God's voice or is that Isaac's voice who really wants to go do this instead? So that is a great reminder. The more we listen to him, the more we can recognize his voice, the more we can follow him. Well, I'm really excited for this week as we talk to kids and preschoolers how we can listen to God and how knowing him more can help us listen to him more. So we are praying for you. We say that a lot, but we really, truly are praying for you. Every Tuesday, our team gets together and we actually pray for you all as leaders, as volunteers, as people who are on the front lines teaching these kids and preschoolers these amazing truths about who God is and how they can follow him. So know we are praying for you. Know that we are here in your corner cheering you on as you go out and teach this week. So until next time, we'll talk to you later. Bye.